The rain had just let up outside Carter's Diner, that old brick and chrome place on the corner of Jefferson and Main, the kind where the smell of bacon grease and strong coffee clung to your clothes long after you left. Inside, a few locals were scattered across red vinyl booths, the air humming with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of forks against plates. At the counter, sitting on the same stool he'd claimed every Saturday for as long as anyone could remember, was Henry Jacobs, 81 years old, tall even in his age, shoulders still squared from years of military service, though his frame had thinned. His eyes sharp, warm, and observant, had the kind of depth you see in men who've seen more of the world than they care to talk about. Henry was a veteran of 2 wars, Korea first, then Vietnam. He'd worn the uniform when it wasn't easy, when being a black soldier meant fighting not only the enemy overseas but prejudice in the ranks. He had been spat on when he returned home, denied service in restaurants like this one back in the day. Still, he stood for the flag, not because the country had always stood for him, but because he had stood for the ideals it claimed to represent. That morning, Henry wore his old army cap, the one embroidered with faded yellow letters, 1st Cavalry Division. It was his quiet badge of honor. He sat, sipping his coffee, waiting for the plate of scrambled eggs and grits he ordered every week. The waitress, Marlene, always kept his cup full. Then the sound of bootstick, heavy biker boots got through the diner. A group of 5 men had come in, leather jackets and patches marking them as part of some local motorcycle club, the kind whose presence made the air feel heavier. They laughed loud, swaggering toward the back, but one of them, a tall man with a wiry beard and a sneer that seemed permanent, stopped when he saw Henry. "Look at this," the man drawled, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Old man playing soldier. What's that hat mean? Huh, you steal it from a real vet." Marlene stiffened behind the counter. Henry's eyes met the man's, steady, calm, unflinching. "Son," Henry said, his voice even but edged with steel, "I earned this hat before you were even a thought in your daddy's head." The biker smirked, stepped closer. "Yeah, well, I don't believe it. You people always got some story, huh?" A couple at the corner booth exchanged uneasy glances. Conversations faltered. Henry didn't rise to the bait. He'd dealt with this kind of man before. But then, without warning, the biker leaned in and slapped the cap off Henry's head. The sound was sharp flesh against flesh and the diner went silent. Henry didn't move right away. He just looked at the man, his jaw set, his dignity intact, even in the face of insult. "Pick it up," Henry said quietly. The biker laughed and walked back to his table, leaving the cap on the floor like discarded trash. No one else moved. Not yet. Marlene, trembling, picked up the phone from behind the counter. She wasn't sure who she meant to call police. Maybe, but before she could decide, Henry waved her off. Slowly, with deliberate care, he bent to retrieve his cap. His hand lingered on it for a moment before he placed it back on his head. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, but he did pull a small flip phone from his pocket and dial a number. The entire diner could hear his side of the conversation, though he spoke softly. "Son, it's your father," he said. "I'm at Carter's. Got some trouble here." A pause. "Yeah, bring the boys." When he hung up, there was a new weight in the room. Henry went back to his coffee like nothing had happened, though his hand trembled just slightly as he lifted the cup. The bikers laughed among themselves, confident in their numbers, ignorant of the history they had just stepped on. 22 minutes. That's how long it took. It started with the sound of engine steep, synchronized, disciplined. Not the scattered roar of bikers, but the precise hum of military-grade machines. Heads turned as a convoy of matte black SUVs rolled down Jefferson Street, stopping in a perfect line outside the diner. Doors opened, and men stepped out, not in uniform, but in the unmistakable bearing of soldiers. Broad shoulders, alert eyes, movements that spoke of training and readiness. Leading them was a man who looked like Henry in younger, heavier in muscle, but with the same set of the jaw, the same steel in the gaze. This was Marcus Jacobs, Henry's son, retired Army Ranger, now heading a veteran outreach program that doubled as a brotherhood for those who had served. These weren't just friends. They were men who knew combat, men whose loyalty was forged in fire. Inside the diner, the bikers were mid-laugh when the door swung open. Marcus entered first, his eyes locking on his father. He didn't speak right away. He just took in the scene, scanning the room, reading every face. "Dad," he said finally, his voice low but carrying. "You all right?" Henry nodded once. "I'm fine, but there's a man here who thinks my service and my life ain't worth respect." The room held its breath. Marcus's gaze shifted toward the biker with the wiry beard, the one still leaning back in his booth with a smirk. The soldier's eyes narrowed, and behind him, the other veterans stepped inside, fanning out, quiet, composed, but radiating an unspoken promise. Whatever happened next would not be what Marcus didn't rush his steps. He walked with a kind of deliberate control that made the air feel tighter with each second. The other veterans, 10 of them in total, spread through the diner in silent formation, not touching a single customer but placing themselves in subtle positions of control. These were men trained to de-escalate, but also trained never to back down when a line had been crossed. The biker with the wiry beard shifted in his seat, the smirk flickering just slightly as Marcus stopped at his table. "You, the one?" Marcus asked, his tone flat, almost conversational. The biker tried to mask his discomfort with bravado. "What if I am?" Marcus leaned down, his face inches from the man's. His voice dropped to a low register that made every syllable feel heavier. "Then you just laid hands on a man who's earned more honor than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. You slapped my father. You spat on his service. That means you disrespected every soldier in this room. And that is a problem you don't want." The biker's companions shifted uneasily. They weren't used to being outnumbered, not in spirit, not in presence. But here, in this diner, they were surrounded by men who had faced real danger. Men who had carried rifles into war zones and brought their brothers home under flags. Henry spoke from the counter, his voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Marcus, let the man answer for himself." Marcus straightened, stepping aside so the biker could see Henry clearly. "Go on," Marcus said. "Tell him what you told me." The biker's jaw tightened. For a moment, his eyes darted to the door, calculating whether he could just walk out. But 2 veterans had already positioned themselves near the exit, not blocking it, but making it clear that leaving without words wasn't an option. "I don't owe him nothing," the biker muttered. Marlene, still frozen behind the counter, finally spoke up, her voice trembling with indignation. "You hit an 81-year-old man. In my diner, a man who's never been anything but kind to anyone who's come through that door. And you think you don't owe him an apology?" Silence stretched. The biker glanced at his friends, but they weren't backing him the way they had before. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was gone. The veterans didn't threaten violence, they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to strip away the swagger. Marcus took a slow step forward again. "You want to walk out of here with your dignity. Then you stand up, you look this man in the eye, and you give him the respect he earned long before you learned how to ride a motorcycle." The biker hesitated, his pride wrestling with the growing pressure in the room. Finally, with a stiff motion, he stood. He didn't look at Henry right away. It took a visible effort to lift his eyes to meet the old veteran's steady gaze. "Sorry," he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. Henry didn't blink. "For what?" The biker swallowed. "For hitting you, for disrespecting you." Henry nodded slowly, then extended his hand not out of obligation, but because he believed in leaving a man the chance to be better. Then be the kind of man who doesn't need to be reminded. The biker stared at the offered hand for a long second before shaking it, his grip tentative. Without another word, he and his crew made for the door, their boots heavy on the diner floor. The veterans parted to let them through, watching them leave, but offering no further comment. When the door shut behind them, the diner exhaled as if it had been holding its breath the entire time. Marcus turned back to his father. "You all right?" Henry smiled faintly. "I've been through worse, but I'm proud to see you stand tall, son." One of the other veterans, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, spoke up. "Man disrespects a soldier. He disrespects the whole line. Doesn't matter the color, the war, or the years. We protect our own." Henry's gaze softened. "It does matter the color," he said quietly. "It's different when you've worn the uniform in a country that didn't want you in it. That's why we stand for each other. Not just because we served, but because we know what it costs to serve when they think you don't belong." The room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of reflection. Even the strangers in the booths understood they had just witnessed something more than a confrontation. It was a moment of dignity defended not with fists, but with presence, unity, and an unshakable sense of worth. Marcus put a hand on his father's shoulder. "Let's get you home." Henry shook his head. "Not yet. I'm going to finish my breakfast." Marlene smiled through her lingering nerves and set a fresh plate of scrambled eggs and grits in front of him. "On the house," she said. Henry chuckled. "I fought for the right to pay for my own meal. Put it on my tab." The veteran stayed for coffee, filling the diner with low conversation and bursts of quiet laughter. The tension that had gripped the room was gone, replaced with something warmer, more solid. Customers who had been silent now approached Henry to shake his hand, thanking him for his service not out of pity, but out of recognition. Outside, the rain began again, tapping gently against the diner's wide front windows. The convoy of black SUVs remained parked along the street until Henry finished his breakfast. When he finally stood to leave, the veterans rose with him, walking him out like an honor guard. The bikers were nowhere to be seen. Whether they had learned something or just decided never to cross paths again, no one could say. But their absence was its own answer. As Marcus helped his father into the front seat of the lead SUV, Henry looked at him with a quiet pride. "You came fast," he said. Marcus smiled. "You called. That's all it takes." The convoy pulled away from Carter's diner, engines low and steady, disappearing into the wet streets. But the story lingered. For days, people in town talked about what had happened. Some spoke about the fear in the bikers' eyes when the veterans arrived. Others talked about the calm in Henry's voice, the refusal to be diminished. For the black men who had served in that community, men who had known the double burden of fighting for a country while fighting for their place in its story, meant something deeper. It was a reminder that respect is not given freely to all, but that dignity is not something anyone can take without your consent. Henry never brought it up again. When asked, he would just say, "Some folks need to be reminded where the line is. We showed them." Then he would change the subject, because to him, the point had been made. But for the people who had been in Carter's diner that morning, it became more than a local story. It became a parable about standing together, about the weight of service, and about the quiet, unshakable pride that no slap, no insult, no ignorance could erase. And somewhere, in the unspoken space between a father and son, there was the knowledge that when the call comes, whether from a battlefield or a diner counter, there will be an answer, always.